The moon of Ve circled its dying gas giant in silence older than empires. No oceans remained upon its surface, no forests, no memory of natural life endured beneath the ash-colored sky. Vast cathedrals of iron and obsidian stood alone across endless plains of frozen dust, their towers crowned with antennae that clawed upward into the heavens like skeletal fingers begging for forgotten gods. Beneath those towers, hidden within vaults, lined by silver scripture and chains of sanctified bone, the choir of Saint Halcyon continued its eternal vigil. For 6 centuries, the astropaths of Ve had served the Imperium faithfully. Blind from infancy, soul-branded by ritual flame, they sat upon black thrones surrounding the Chamber of Murmurs and listened endlessly to the tides of the warp. Through agony they carried messages between dying stars. Through suffering they preserved the arteries of a collapsing civilization. They had endured madness before. They had endured whispers, but never laughter. The signal first arrived during the 13th hour of the moon's false night cycle. Astropath Elian Vek sensed it before the others did. He froze within his throne as cold spread through his nervous system like submerged knives. Around him, hundreds of censers swung upon rusted chains, filling the chamber with sacred incense. Choir servitors muttered prayers in metallic monotones. The great amplification engines thrummed beneath the floor. Then the static changed. At first it resembled distant interference, a corruption within the psychic current, the ordinary sickness of warp storm residue. Yet beneath the distortion, Vek heard something impossible. Children, not words, not language, merely soft laughter echoing through immense distance. His scared hands tightened against the throne restraints. The sound multiplied. One voice became several became dozens. Their laughter overlapped in strange rhythm, rising and falling like a nursery rhyme remembered by a dying mind. Beneath the mirth lurked wet breathing and the scrape of something enormous dragging itself across stone. Vex screamed. The psychic backlash struck the choir instantly. Blind astropaths convulsed within their iron seats as blood erupted from their noses and empty eye sockets. Some tore free from their restraints in panic. Others began laughing uncontrollably, their voices twisting into childish shrieks that echoed through the cathedral vaults. The signal strengthened. Every amplification bell in the chamber rang simultaneously. A servitor exploded without warning, showering parchment prayers across the floor. Sacred candles extinguished themselves. Frost crawled across the black walls despite the furnace heat. Then came the balloons. Red spheres drifted soundlessly through the darkness above the choir chamber, descending from shadows where no entrance existed. Their surfaces glistened like fresh arterial blood. Thin strings dangled beneath them, swaying gently though the air remained perfectly still. Astropath Vek felt tears running from his ruined eyes. He remembered balloons. Not from adulthood, not from service, from childhood, before the black ships, before the Emperor. A memory he had not touched in 40 years unfolded inside his skull with horrifying clarity. Rainwater flowing through alley gutters, his mother's hand wrapped around his wrist. Crimson balloons floating above a crowded festival, while distant music played somewhere beyond the fog. And standing between the crowd, smiling, Vek tried to speak a warning, but the signal reached deeper. Something moved within the psychic current surrounding the choir. Vast, ancient, hungry. The entity did not force entry through violence. It arrived gently, peeling back the minds of the astropaths like thin paper. It searched their fears patiently, reverently, as though savoring sacred scripture. One choir member began clawing at his own face until bone showed beneath his nails. Another whispered prayers backward in a child's voice. A third simply stopped breathing while continuing to laugh. Overseer Maltheus entered the chamber moments later with armed sanctifiers at his side. The old priest halted immediately beneath the vaulted doorway. Horror spread across his weathered features as he witnessed the chaos, consuming the choir. Bodies convulsed against iron restraints. Blood covered the scripture-lined floor, and above them all floated hundreds of red balloons. "Seal the chamber," Maltheus ordered. No one obeyed. The sanctifiers stared upward in frozen terror. Because the balloons were multiplying, they drifted from darkness endlessly now, brushing softly against cathedral ceilings before descending among the screaming astropaths. One settled before Malthius himself. Its polished surface reflected his aging face in warped proportions. Then the balloon spoke. Not aloud. Inside his mind. "Do you remember your brother?" Malthius staggered backward. The memory struck instantly. A frozen river beneath the sun of old terror. Two boys laughing while thin ice cracked beneath their feet. The screams afterward. His brother's hand disappearing beneath black water while Malthius stood helpless upon the shore. The priest collapsed to his knees. No soul aboard Ve knew of that memory. No record existed. Yet the thing within the signal knew. It knew them all. The chamber lights died completely. Darkness swallowed the cathedral. And within that abyss, laughter echoed from every direction at once. The sanctifiers opened fire blindly. Bolts screamed across the chamber, detonating against stone pillars and iron thrones. Explosions illuminated fragments of nightmare. Distorted faces grinning within the dark. Impossible limbs unfolding between drifting balloons. Shadows moving with insect-like precision across the vaulted ceiling. Then silence fell. Absolute silence. The firing stopped. The screaming ended. Only the breathing of terrified men remained. Slowly, the emergency lumen globes flickered alive. The choir chamber stood empty. Every astropath was gone. Their restraints hung open. Their blood remained fresh upon the floor, but no bodies existed. At the chamber's center, written in crimson across the black stone tiles, appeared a single phrase none of the sanctifiers understood. "Let them laugh." Far beneath the cathedrals of Ve, something ancient opened its eyes within the dark. News of the disaster on Ve never reached the wider Imperium intact. The final transmissions transmitted from the moon arrived fragmented beyond recognition. Vox priests stationed within nearby systems described waves of corrupted static overwhelming entire communication relays. Astropathic messages dissolved midway through translation into meaningless shrieks and bursts of childish laughter. Several relay stations self-terminated their choirs after reports of mass hallucinations spreading among sanctioned psychers. Then the silence came. An unnatural stillness settled across the Ve subsector, as though the warp itself had drawn breath and refused to release it again. 3 weeks later, the first disappearances began upon Serathel. The hive world had endured 10,000 years of decay beneath imperial dominion. Immense manufactorums consumed entire mountain ranges while billions of laborers rotted within endless industrial catacombs. Above the lower hives, cathedral spires pierced permanently clouded skies. Sacred incense mixed with chemical smog. The bells of devotion rang day and night over oceans of exhausted humanity. Fear already lived comfortably upon Serathel. That was why the thing came there. The disappearances started in the district of Vanish Reach, deep within the middle hive levels. Entire habitation blocks emptied overnight without signs of violence. Enforcer patrols found meals still warm upon tables. Machinery continued functioning. Infant cradles rocked gently in abandoned chambers. But no bodies remained. No blood. No struggle. Only absence. At first, the planetary authorities dismissed the incidents as cult activity. Serathel possessed thousands of hidden sects thriving beneath the shadow of imperial law. Some worshipped forbidden machine spirits. Others mutilated themselves in search of imagined purity. Entire generations vanished regularly within the underhive labyrinths, yet the reports continued spreading upward through the hive. District after district fell silent. The strange details troubled investigators most. Witnesses described crimson balloons floating through alleyways before each disappearance. Children spoke of hearing laughter echoing from drainage tunnels beneath the streets. Several survivors claimed they had seen loved ones standing motionless inside cathedral ruins hours after those individuals had already vanished. Then came the eyes. Enforcer Captain Rem Vallis discovered the first bodies within the Basilica district during the second month of disappearances. His patrol entered the Cathedral of St. Caro after local clergy reported hearing hymns sung within the bod. Abandoned structure during curfew hours. The cathedral interior appeared untouched initially. Candles burned upon the altar. Incense lingered in the air. Ancient murals depicting imperial martyrs covered the towering walls. Then the patrol reached the prayer nave. Hundreds of corpses knelt silently between the pews. Men, women, children. Every victim wore the expressionless calm of dreamless sleep, and every pair of eyes had been removed with impossible precision. Not carved, not gouged, taken cleanly, leaving smooth, hollow sockets untouched by blood. Captain Vallis ordered his men to withdraw immediately. Before they reached the entrance, the cathedral doors slammed shut on their own. The candles extinguished. Darkness consumed the nave. Then laughter drifted through the cathedral, soft at first, childlike, playful. The enforcers raised their rifles toward the shadows. Flashlights trembled across rows of kneeling corpses. Something moved among them. Vallis glimpsed pale limbs unfolding between the pews with unnatural length. He heard wet footsteps crossing marble floors. Several enforcers began muttering prayers uncontrollably. Then one of the corpses lifted its head. The dead child smiled through empty eye sockets. Others followed. Rows of hollow faces turned slowly toward the patrol, and from somewhere high within the cathedral rafters, a voice whispered gently through the darkness. "Do you know why they gave them to me?" One enforcer fired instantly. The gunshot shattered stained glass overhead. Red moonlight spilled into the cathedral. For one terrible second, the patrol saw the thing above them. It crouched upside down upon the vaulted ceiling like a monstrous insect wrapped in funeral robes. Its limbs were too long. Its grin stretched impossibly wide through layers of sharp silver teeth, clusters of crimson. Balloons drifted around its body like living organs. But its eyes remained worst of all. Not monstrous, not alien. Human. Countless human eyes blinking across its flesh. The cathedral exploded into panic. Enforcers opened fire wildly while bodies rose from the pews around them. Blind corpses stumbled forward through bolter flashes, reaching with skeletal hands. The creature descended among them in impossible motion, folding through darkness rather than crossing distance. Captain Vallis saw one of his men lifted screaming into the air. Then silence. Blood rained across the nave. The patrol broke formation instantly. Some fled toward side corridors. Others vanished beneath masses of grasping corpses. One officer clawed out his own eyes while laughing hysterically. Vallis alone reached the cathedral entrance. He forced the great doors open and stumbled into the fog-covered streets beyond. The city alarms were already sounding. Across the Basilica district, red balloons drifted upward between cathedral spires. Thousands of them ascended through the poisoned sky in silent procession. And beneath their shadows, the people of Serathel began disappearing faster than the authorities could count. Panic spread through the hive world soon after. Pilgrims abandoned holy districts. Manufacturing workers refused night shifts. Rumors infested every level of society. Some claimed a demon had entered the hive beneath the guise of a laughing saint. Others believed the emperor himself had cursed Serathel for hidden sins. But the oldest citizens whispered different stories. Stories far older than imperial rule. Tales from forgotten generations describing a smiling thing that emerged whenever fear consumed the world deeply enough. A thing that wore many faces. A thing that fed. Deep within the upper hive citadel, Governor Halbrecht finally authorized transmission requests toward the Holy Inquisition. Yet even as the astropaths prepared the plea for aid, strange interference corrupted the chamber signals. The static returned, and hidden beneath the distortion, every operator heard children laughing softly through the dark. The request for aid never reached the Inquisition in its intended form. The signal from Serathel fractured long before it crossed the subsector boundary, splitting into corrupted echoes that repeated the same impossible phrase in diminishing clarity. Laughter beneath stone, laughter beneath stone, laughter beneath stone. Only one fragment remained intact enough to compel response, and it was enough to draw the attention of Ordo Hereticus assets already monitoring peripheral disturbances around the Vey Silence. Inquisitor Malachai Sorn arrived in orbit above Serathel within 9 days of the first confirmed mass disappearances. His vessel, the Silent Verity, descended through sulfuric cloud banks that shrouded the hive world like a burial veil. From orbit, Serathel appeared unchanged, a functioning imperial fortress world continuing its endless labor cycles beneath sacred spires. Yet Sorn had seen enough dying worlds to recognize the subtle deviation in atmospheric motion, the unnatural stillness where psychic resonance should have churned with human thought. He did not land in the upper hive districts. Instead, he ordered descent directly into the Basilica district, where disappearances had been most concentrated and where the cathedral authorities had last reported structured patterns within the chaos. The landing craft touched down upon cracked marble plazas surrounded by statues of saints, whose faces had been defaced by time or deliberate violence. No welcoming delegation awaited him. Only silence, and the faint echo of distant bells ringing without visible source. Sorn advanced with a retinue of 5 sanctioned agents, each bearing wards inscribed in bone and silvered parchment. The air grew heavier as they approached the Basilica of St. Caro, the same cathedral where Enforcer Captain Valis had reported mass casualty events days earlier. The great doors stood open now, though no record indicated they had been forced. They hung ajar as though inviting passage, their hinges crusted with a residue that shimmered faintly when exposed to light. Inside the cathedral, the nave extended farther than architectural schematics allowed. Pillars stretched upward into darkness that swallowed lumen light without reflection. The stained glass windows no longer depicted imperial saints but shifting silhouettes that resembled countless human faces overlapping one another in endless permutation. The air carried the scent of incense and something older, something organic, like damp earth disturbed after centuries of burial. Sorn ordered his agents to proceed. They moved in formation through rows of pews that were no longer empty. Figures knelt within them, motionless, facing the altar. At first glance they appeared to be worshippers in silent devotion. Only when one agent reached out and touched a shoulder did the truth reveal itself. The bodies were hollow shells, their internal structures removed entirely, leaving only skin draped over fragile frameworks of bone, and yet they still breathed. Slowly, synchronously, as though the cathedral itself inhaled through them. The retinue pressed deeper toward the basilica's central sanctum. With each step, the geometry of the structure seemed to shift subtly, corridors extending where none should exist, arches leading into spaces unrecorded by imperial survey. Sorn recognized the phenomenon immediately, localized reality distortion consistent with minor warp intrusion, but lacking the violence typical of daemonic breach. This was something else, something patient. At the heart of the basilica lay the sealed reliquary vault, a chamber reserved for relics of sainted martyrs and guarded by gene-coded locks. The doors stood open. Inside there was no relic, only a banquet. Long tables constructed from bone and fused metal stretched across the chamber, laden not with food but with arranged human memories made manifest, fragments of childhood laughter crystallized into shimmering spheres, grief shaped into dark viscous pools, joy rendered as flickering light trapped beneath glass. Around the tables sat figures dressed in ecclesiastical vestments, their faces obscured by ornate masks carved in exaggerated expressions of delight. They were not eating, they were consuming. Each masked figure reached toward the offerings and absorbed them through touch, as though drawing nourishment from emotion itself. With every consumed memory, their forms shifted subtly, becoming more defined, more real. At the far end of the table sat the entity. It did not rise. It did not speak. It simply turned its head towards Sorn as though it had been expecting him for a very long time. The masks around the chamber froze in unison. Then slowly they turned as well. Sorn felt the pressure of countless unseen minds pressing against his consciousness. Memories not his own surfaced without permission. A childhood festival beneath a burning sky, a lost sibling calling from beneath frozen water, a balloon drifting through a dead cathedral. He understood then. This was not infestation. This was interpretation. The entity did not consume flesh or souls directly. It consumed the structure through which humanity understood itself. Faith, memory, fear, and reshaped them into sustenance. One of Sorn's agents collapsed, laughing uncontrollably as tears streamed from his face. Another drew his weapon and placed the barrel beneath his jaw, whispering prayers in reverse. Sorn remained still, The entity rose at last. Its form shifted constantly, never settling into singular shape. At times it resembled a child, at others, a priest, then a monstrous silhouette too large for the chamber itself. But always, beneath every transformation, there remained the suggestion of a smile that did not belong to any known anatomy. It spoke without voice. "You brought more fear." The masked figures resumed their feast. The basilica trembled. Sorn realized the truth with clinical clarity. Serethel was not being invaded, it was being curated. Each act of terror strengthened the structure around the entity. Each witness expanded its domain. Inquisitor Malachi Sorn withdrew from the Basilica of St. Caro within moments that later testimony would fail to reconstruct with consistency. What remained of his retinue did not follow. Some accounts claimed they simply ceased to exist once they crossed the threshold back into the nave. Others insisted they walked out beside him but were never recorded by external auspex arrays. The only certainty was that Sorn returned to the silent verity alone, and that Serethel's planetary seal was immediately placed under quarantine protocol by his authority. Yet quarantine was already a meaningless gesture. Across the hive world, the phenomenon had evolved. Where once there had been disappearances and hollowed cathedrals, there now emerged something far more deliberate. Witnesses began reporting a solitary figure moving through the mid-hive transit arteries during planetary night cycle. It appeared first in the district of Oran, Spire, then in 3 separate manufactorum zones simultaneously, and later within the sealed ventilation corridors beneath Basilica district itself. No pattern of travel could be established. No transit records existed. Yet it was seen everywhere that fear concentrated. The figure was always described the same way. Tall, human in outline, clothed in the remnants of pilgrim robes that shifted in color depending on observer proximity, and most disturbing of all, it bore no face. Where a head should have been, there was only smooth, pale absence, as though reality had forgotten how to define identity in that space. Some claimed they saw faint impressions upon it when viewed indirectly, suggestions of eyes, mouths, or expressions that dissolved the moment attention fixed upon them. Others insisted it reflected whatever fear the observer carried most deeply, reshaping itself into something intimately personal yet never stable. The Adeptus Arbites initially dismissed these reports as mass hysteria induced by atmospheric contamination. That conclusion collapsed within hours, when entire enforcement precincts began reporting identical encounters without cross-communication. The pilgrim without a face did not attack. It did not speak. It simply arrived. In the transit hub of Lower Oran Spire, it stood at the center of a crowded concourse during shift change. Thousands of workers moved around it without acknowledging its presence. Only those who met its position directly felt the change. One worker dropped his tools and began sobbing uncontrollably, describing a childhood memory of being lost in an abandoned hive tunnel where something had whispered his name from the dark. Another fell into silence so complete that Medicae later confirmed total psychic suppression of speech. Centers without physical trauma. The pilgrim remained motionless until the crowd thinned. Then it turned toward the ventilation shafts and walked downward into the structure of the hive itself. Within 3 days, it had become embedded in Serethel's infrastructure. It appeared in data vault corridors where machine spirits failed without explanation. It stood at the edges of ration lines where riots had been moments before, and after its presence, the crowds dispersed without memory of why they had gathered. It was seen reflected in water reclamation reservoirs, despite standing nowhere near them. Each sighting was accompanied by localized lapses in identity recognition among witnesses, as though the act of perceiving it stripped away certainty of self. In the Upper Hive Citadel, Governor Halbrecht ordered containment sweeps of all mid-level districts. Arbite's forces descended in coordinated purges, searching for cult activity or infiltrating agents of the unknown entity identified by Inquisitor Sorn. Yet, every sweep ended the same way. Squads entering confirmed sighting zones would lose coordination within minutes, communication breaking into fragmented reports of absence in human form and walking silence. One squad returned to extraction point with no casualties, but every member had forgotten their own names. The pilgrim was last seen with them. Sorn reviewed these reports aboard the Silent Verity, while Serathol's orbit degraded under increasing warp turbulence. He noted a pattern emerging beneath the chaos. Wherever the entity known as the Feast beneath the Basilica expanded its influence, the pilgrim appeared shortly afterward, as though dispatched rather than manifested. One consumed emotion, the other removed identity. Together they did not destroy population centers. They unmade the structure that defined humanity within them. A fragment of Auspex data retrieved from Lower Oran Spire provided the first concrete anomaly. During a sweep of abandoned hab blocks, Arbite's picked capture devices briefly recorded the pilgrim standing before a wall covered in children's drawings. The images were ordinary: houses, suns, stick figures. But every drawing contained the same balloon, red, hovering above erased heads. Then, in the final frame, the pilgrim raised one hand toward the wall. Every drawing changed simultaneously. The houses became cathedrals, the suns became eyes, and the stick figures lost their faces. The recording terminated at that moment due to complete system overwrite. Within hours, entire districts of Serathel began reporting coordinated memory loss events. Citizens would forget the purpose of their own actions mid-sentence. Families failed to recognize one another while standing face to face. Enforcers abandoned post without issuing orders, later unable to explain their own departure. And always, just before collapse of identity, the pilgrim appeared at the periphery of perception. Watching, waiting, unchanging. Sorn attempted a targeted psi intervention using surviving astropathic fragments from Vey, but the response was immediate and catastrophic. The moment the psychic choirs focused on the pilgrim's signature, the signal inverted. Instead of reaching outward, the warp resonance folded inward upon the remaining astropaths stationed aboard the Silent Verity. Every psyker on board simultaneously fell silent mid-chant, their expressions blank, as though something had gently removed the concept of self from their minds. Only one survived long enough to speak. He described standing in a corridor that did not exist, facing a faceless figure who asked him nothing, and yet somehow received everything. Then he forgot how to continue speaking. Seraphel's descent accelerated. Cathedrals across the Basilica district reported spontaneous congregation events where citizens assembled without instruction, standing in perfect silence for hours until their faces gradually smoothed into uniform blankness. No violence occurred, no coercion was observed, only gradual surrender of identity, as though recognition of self was no longer sustainable within proximity of the phenomenon. The pilgrim without a face moved steadily upward through the hive, and wherever it passed, the Imperium did not scream. It simply forgot how to remember. Serathel did not break. It did not fall in a single decisive catastrophe that could be recorded, measured, and understood by Imperial doctrine. Instead, it unraveled in layers, each collapse more intimate than the last, until the distinction between population and absence became indistinguishable. Inquisitor Sorn's final consolidated report described it as a soft extinction of meaning, though even that phrase failed to capture the methodical erosion spreading through the hive world. The pilgrim without a face continued its ascent through the hive's upper strata, but it was no longer alone in its influence. Something else had begun to emerge from the lower districts, from the forgotten ventilation systems and collapsed under hive arteries where light had not reached in centuries. Unlike the pilgrim, these new manifestations were not silent. They were singing. At first, the sound was mistaken for auditory hallucination caused by atmospheric toxins. Workers in the manufacturing belts reported faint melodies echoing through machinery vents, songs without language that nevertheless carried emotional weight. Nostalgia, grief, and a strange, unsettling joy. Arbite's patrols dismissed the reports until entire shifts began to synchronize their movements unconsciously with the rhythm of these unheard tunes. Then the children appeared. They were first sighted in the abandoned transit levels beneath Basilica District, where structural collapse had sealed entire corridors from sanctioned access. Surveillance drones sent to investigate recorded figures moving through the dark spaces between broken pillars and ruptured conduits. Small silhouettes too slight for adult workers, yet moving with coordinated precision through labyrinthine ruins. When Arbite's recovery teams entered those same sectors, They found no children at all, only remnants, discarded respirators painted in bright colors, fragments of cloth stitched into makeshift banners, and symbols carved into ferrocrete walls depicting spirals, masks, and smiling suns distorted beyond recognition. The symbols repeated across multiple districts without variation, as if learned collectively, as if taught. Within 3 standard days of the first confirmed sightings, entire underhive populations began disappearing voluntarily. Unlike the earlier vanishings associated with the cathedral entity or the identity erosion of the faceless pilgrim, these events involved no fear or confusion. Witnesses described scenes of organized descent, where groups of children and adolescents moved together into sealed transit tunnels beneath the hive, guided by unseen rhythms only they could hear. Some Arbeitsofficers attempted to intervene. They reported that the children did not resist. They simply looked at their pursuers with expressions of calm recognition, as though already familiar with their fate. And then they smiled. Those smiles were described in every report as identical. Too wide, too synchronized, too deliberate, as if copied from a single source. The first confirmed contact occurred when a sanctioned recovery squad breached a collapsed tunnel beneath Oran Spire and encountered what would later be designated the Black Carnival. The squad's picked recorders transmitted partial imagery before systems failed due to unexplained psychic interference. The footage showed a subterranean chamber expanded far beyond structural plausibility, its walls reinforced by fused debris and organic growths resembling hardened resin. Within this space, hundreds of children stood in concentric formations around makeshift structures constructed from broken machinery and ritualized scrap. Their clothing had been altered into uniform patterns of black fabric, stitched with reflective thread that caught dim light like fractured stars. Masks fashioned from painted metal and bone obscured their faces, each one carved into expressions of exaggerated joy or sorrow. At the center of the chamber stood a stage. Upon it moved figures larger than the children, though their proportions were inconsistent, shifting between elongated silhouettes and grotesquely compressed forms. They wore garments assembled from scavenged ecclesiastical vestments, manufacturum insulation, and fragments of Arbeits uniform plating. Their movements were theatrical, almost ceremonial, as they enacted performances without audience direction. They were laughing. Not the uncontrolled mirth of madness, but structured, rhythmic laughter, synchronized with the children's movements in the surrounding circle. The recovery squad reported that the moment they entered the chamber, every child turned to face them simultaneously. No delay, no variation. Every masked face oriented toward the intruders with mechanical precision. Then the performance stopped. Silence spread through the Black Carnival like a held breath. One of the larger figures descended from the stage and approached the squad. Its mask was painted in alternating stripes of white and red, fractured by cracks that revealed darkness beneath. It carried a string of crimson balloons that floated upward without wind or tether. The squad opened fire. The bolt struck nothing substantial. Where the figure had stood, only drifting fabric remained, falling slowly to the ground as though gravity itself had lost interest in its presence. Behind the squad, the children began to move. Not forward, not backward, inward. They collapsed into motion as a single coordinated mass, encircling the squad without running, without urgency, as if reenacting choreography long perfected. Their masks tilted in unison. Their laughter resumed, echoing through the tunnel in layered harmonics that caused structural resonance failures in the surrounding walls. One Arbeitsofficer dropped his weapon and began removing his helmet. He reported later, before losing coherence entirely, that he needed to join them because the performance required witnesses who could still remember joy. By the time reinforcements arrived, the chamber was empty. No children, no structures, no masks. Only the lingering sound of laughter fading into ventilation shafts that led nowhere. And painted across the ceiling in what appeared to be condensed atmospheric moisture were the words, "We are practicing for something larger." Sorn received this transmission moments before Serathel's planetary communication grid began collapsing entirely. Across multiple districts, Citizens who had not yet vanished reported synchronized dreams of carnival processions moving through endless black corridors beneath the hive. They described music without source, laughter without speaker, and a distant sensation of anticipation building within their minds. The pilgrim without a face was seen once more during this period, standing at the edge of a collapsed underhive stairwell overlooking the Black Carnival's last known location. Witnesses could not determine whether it observed the children or was observed by them. For the first time, it did not move. And for the first time, something within Serathel moved toward it. The movement beneath Serathel did not resemble invasion. It resembled convergence. Inquisitor Malachi Sorn observed the transition from the command sanctum of the Silent Verity as the hive world's psychic signature altered in real time beneath mounting warp turbulence. Serathel no longer pulsed with the chaotic noise of billions of individual minds. That noise had begun to harmonize. Fear, memory, identity, and devotion were no longer separate emotional currents, but components of something gradually organizing itself into singular purpose. The phenomenon spread beyond the planet soon after. The first external incident occurred aboard the merchant vessel Covenant of Mercy while traversing the outer trade lanes near the Vey subsector. Midway through warp translation, the ship's astropathic choir ceased routine communication and began transmitting an unauthorized vocal sequence across all frequencies. The transmission lasted precisely 47 seconds before the choir chamber suffered total neural collapse. The recovered recording was fragmented, but one detail remained consistent in every analysis. Children were singing, not words at first, only melody. A slow circular rhythm accompanied by distant laughter and the sound of bells tolling beneath immense pressure. Then, near the end of the recording, the voices aligned into coherent language. When the red moons rise, open the door and let us inside. Every astropath aboard the Covenant of Mercy died moments later. Their bodies showed no signs of physical trauma, yet autopsy revealed catastrophic neural degradation consistent with prolonged warp exposure. More disturbing still, each corpse wore the same expression, peaceful delight, as though death had arrived in the form of long-awaited reunion. The incident was classified immediately by sector authorities. 3 days later, identical transmissions emerged from 7 additional vessels, then 17, then entire relay stations. Across neighboring systems, astropathic choirs began collapsing under synchronized psychic episodes. Survivors described hearing nursery hymns echoing through the warp long before transmissions manifested in real space equipment. Several psychers claimed they could see red celestial bodies drifting through the Imperium itself, vast crimson moons hanging motionless within the currents of unreality. No astronomical records supported their existence, yet the visions spread regardless. On Serathel, the effects intensified catastrophically. Citizens throughout the hive began waking simultaneously during night cycle hours, drawn instinctively toward windows, cathedral balconies, and observation platforms. Above the poisoned atmosphere, through layers of industrial haze and orbital cloud cover, faint red luminescence now appeared in the sky. Not one moon, many. Dozens of crimson circles suspended beyond the clouds, too large and too near to obey natural law. Some nights they vanished completely. Other nights they multiplied. The ecclesiarchy declared them manifestations of warp contamination and ordered continuous prayer observances across all surviving districts. But even among the clergy, faith had begun to fracture under psychological pressure. Priests forgot liturgical sequences mid-sermon. Choirs drifted unconsciously into the same forbidden melody transmitted through the astropathic networks. Entire congregations entered trance states lasting hours, swaying in silence while tears streamed down their faces. And beneath the hive, the Black Carnival continued growing. Scattered reconnaissance footage revealed immense processions of children moving through underhive corridors illuminated by hanging red lanterns shaped like moons. More adults now walked among them, though their movements lacked autonomy. They resembled sleepwalkers guided by invisible rhythm, their faces painted with crude smiles drawn in ash and blood. At the center of each procession drifted balloons, thousands of them. Sorn understood the significance too late. The entity beneath Serathel was no longer feeding solely upon fear. It was constructing communion. The psychic harmonization spreading through the subsector represented something unprecedented, a predatory intelligence transforming terror into ritualized unity. Acquire, and every frightened mind became another voice within it. The silent verity attempted emergency withdrawal from Serathel orbit under direct inquisitorial mandate. Before translation procedures completed, however, the ship's navigators reported impossible spatial anomalies forming around the vessel. Warp entry coordinates shifted continuously. Distances between celestial bodies fluctuated without explanation. One navigator claimed the stars themselves appeared closer than before, watching through the void like living eyes. Then the ship's astropathic sanctum activated on its own. Sorn descended personally with armed retainers. The sanctum doors stood open. Inside, the surviving astropaths knelt in perfect formation around the central amplification well, their blind faces tilted upward toward nothing visible. Blood flowed steadily from their eyes and mouths, yet none appeared distressed. Instead, they smiled softly while chanting in unison, the same nursery rhyme. When the red moons rise, open the door and let us inside. The amplification well pulsed with crimson light. Something moved within its depths. Not physically, psychically. An immense pressure radiated upward from the chamber like a vast consciousness pressing against thin fabric. Sorn felt memories surfacing unbidden within his mind. Childhood loneliness, forgotten grief, private guilt buried beneath decades of service. The entity searched through him patiently, selecting emotions with surgical care. One astropath turned toward him. Her empty eye sockets bled steadily as she spoke in a voice that belonged to neither woman nor human. It is learning how to sing through us. The sanctum walls trembled. Across every communication system aboard the silent verity, alarms activated simultaneously. External Vox arrays detected identical transmissions erupting throughout Serathel's orbiting infrastructure. Defense satellites, cargo haulers, ecclesiarchal stations. Every signal carried the same melody now. The choir had spread beyond psychers. Machines themselves had begun repeating the song. Sorn ordered immediate destruction of the sanctum. His retainers hesitated. Not from fear, from recognition. Several had begun humming the melody unconsciously. One lowered his weapon entirely and whispered, with tears in his eyes, "I can hear them practicing." The amplification well ruptured. Crimson light flooded the chamber. For one impassable instant, Sorn saw beyond the veil of reality into a vast darkness filled with drifting red moons and endless processions moving beneath them. Countless figures marched there in silence toward a distant shape too large to comprehend fully. A smiling thing seated upon a throne of hollow faces. Then the vision vanished. The astropaths collapsed dead. But the song did not stop. It continued echoing through the ship's corridors long after every living voice had fallen silent. The Imperium could endure plague. It could endure rebellion, starvation, and planetary collapse. Across 10,000 years of decay, humanity's empire had survived by reducing catastrophe into ritual. Every horror-possessed doctrine, every nightmare had scripture prepared for it. Even the warp itself, in all its impossible cruelty, could be confronted through faith sharpened into weaponized certainty. But Serathel presented a corruption without familiar shape. Fear spread faster than military response. Entire districts ceased functioning not because they had been conquered, but because meaning itself had begun eroding within them. Citizens forgot duty. Priests forgot prayer. Enforcers forgot law. The world was not dying through violence. It was being persuaded into surrender. And so the ecclesiarchy answered in the only manner it understood. It created a saint. Her name before canonization had been Sister Verena Holt of the Ashen Convent, a penitential order stationed within the volcanic shrine cities of Serathel's southern hemisphere. Prior to the crisis, she possessed no extraordinary reputation. Her record described unwavering obedience, severe devotional practices, and repeated exposure to chemical furnace environments that had scarred her lungs permanently. Yet during the third month of the planetary unraveling, reports emerged from the lower shrine districts describing impossible acts surrounding her presence. A crowd afflicted by the memory loss phenomenon regained recognition merely by hearing her speak. A procession infected by the carnival songs fell silent upon seeing her approach. 3 blind pilgrims claimed their sight returned after touching ash from her burned prayer scrolls. Under ordinary circumstances, such reports would have triggered immediate inquisitorial scrutiny. But Serathel no longer operated under ordinary circumstances. The ecclesiarchy, desperate for symbolic resistance against spreading despair, elevated Verena publicly within days. She did not resist the declaration. When the cathedral cardinals anointed her within the Basilica of the 9 Sorrows, witnesses described flames igniting spontaneously across the altar braziers despite inactive fuel lines. Ash descended from the vaulted ceiling like black snow, and when Verena rose from kneeling prayer, blood reportedly streamed from her gums where several teeth had cracked loose beneath the force of her chanting. The crowds interpreted this as divine suffering. They called her the Saint of Ash and Teeth. Sermons spread rapidly through surviving hive districts. Vox systems repeated her prayers continuously. Pilgrims emerged from hiding to follow her processions through plague-stricken sectors where even Arbite's patrols refused deployment. Wherever she traveled, crowds gathered. And for a time, the unraveling slowed. The Black Carnival retreated deeper underground. The faceless congregations dispersed from several cathedrals. Even the red moons above Serathel's skies dimmed slightly during her first public procession through Basilica District. Hope returned. That alone should have terrified Sorn more than it did. Aboard the Silent Verity, the Inquisitor studied recordings of Verena's sermons with growing unease. The woman spoke with conviction, but her cadence carried subtle irregularities. Certain phrases repeated across unrelated speeches with mathematical precision. Her pauses aligned perfectly with fluctuations in the planetary psychic field. Most disturbing of all, crowds exposed to prolonged proximity around her began exhibiting synchronized emotional responses identical to those observed among victims of the choir phenomenon. Not fear. Harmony. Sorn descended personally to investigate. He encountered Verena during a midnight procession moving through the ruined transit avenues near St. Caro's Basilica. Thousands followed her through drifting ash storms while carrying candles fashioned from corpse fat and sacred resin. Hymns echoed between broken cathedral spires. The atmosphere itself felt charged, vibrating faintly with pressure from somewhere beyond ordinary perception. Verena walked barefoot through the ruins. Her robes were stained gray with ash. Burn scars covered her throat and jawline like branching roots. Several of her teeth had indeed shattered, leaving dark gaps visible whenever she spoke. Yet, despite the injuries, she moved without weakness. The crowd parted as Sorn approached. For the first time since Serathel's descent began, silence fell willingly rather than through terror. Verena turned toward him slowly. Her eyes were wrong. Not corrupted. Not possessed. Worse. They reflected understanding. "You have seen it beneath the world," she said softly. Sorn did not answer. "You know now that fear alone is not its hunger." The candles surrounding the procession flickered violently. Shadows stretched unnaturally across ruined stone. Somewhere far beneath the streets, faint carnival music drifted upward through drainage vents. "What are you?" Sorn asked. Verena smiled sadly, exposing broken teeth, a voice speaking loudly enough for it to hear. The crowd knelt simultaneously around them. Sorn felt the psychic pressure immediately. Not invasion. Resonance. The same harmonization spreading through Serathel's choirs and processions now flowed through these worshippers, binding them together beneath shared emotional rhythm. Verena stepped closer. "There are things older than demons," she whispered. "Things born before humanity learned to name fear. It does not hate us. That is why this cannot be fought. You speak of it like scripture." "No." Her gaze lifted toward the red glow hidden behind storm clouds. "Like weather." The procession resumed without command. As the crowds moved past, Sorn noticed subtle deformities among the pilgrims. Teeth filed into points, ash symbols burned into skin. Some lacked faces entirely beneath their hoods, smooth flesh replacing identity with featureless calm. Yet none appeared distressed. They walked as though participating in sacred purpose. Then Sorn saw the children. Dozens of masked youths stood motionless atop nearby ruins, observing the procession silently. Black carnival markings covered their masks. Crimson balloons floated above them in still air. Verena noticed them too, and she bowed her head, not in defiance, in reverence. The realization struck Sorn with sudden cold certainty. The Saint of Ashen Teeth was not resisting the phenomenon spreading across Serathel. She was translating it into faith humanity could survive long enough to accept. Above the hive world, the red moons brightened again behind the clouds. And deep beneath the streets, something vast answered the prayers of the faithful with distant laughter. Serathel did not unify, it was unified. The distinction mattered only to those still capable of resisting what the world had become. Inquisitor Malachi Sorn understood this now with a clarity that bordered on resignation. Every attempted containment, every sanctioned purge, every theological intervention had not slowed the phenomenon consuming the hive world. Each action had instead provided structure to it, as though resistance itself was being absorbed and repurposed into something larger. The Saint of Ashen Teeth continued her processions above ground, drawing fractured remnants of civilization into ritualized order. The children of the Black Carnival expanded beneath the underhive, their massed gatherings now appearing in mapped sectors that should have been physically inaccessible. The pilgrim without a face moved through both layers without distinction, erasing identity wherever stability remained. And above it all, the choir of red moons resonated through warp and machine alike, binding disparate horrors into synchronized rhythm. Yet it was beneath Basilica District where Sorn finally identified the true structure forming. The Silent Verity's deep-range augers detected a vast subterranean anomaly during orbital recalibration. At first it registered as geological distortion, a collapsing cavity within the planetary crust, but repeated scans revealed ordered geometry where chaos should have existed. Chambers aligned in impossible symmetry, corridors extending beyond recorded planetary mass, entire networks of habitation carved not through excavation, but through absence, as though something had been removed to make space for it. Sorn authorized a direct descent team. They did not return. He descended alone afterward. The entry point lay beneath the ruined foundations of the Cathedral of St. Caro, where previous investigations had already recorded multiple psychic anomalies. The access shaft was not hidden. It had never been concealed. Instead, it appeared only when approached with sufficient proximity, as though Serathel itself permitted passage only to those deemed sufficiently acknowledged by whatever intelligence now governed its depths. The descent was not vertical. It was interpretive. Space distorted subtly around Sorn as he moved downward, corridors lengthening and narrowing in ways that contradicted structural logic. Walls bore inscriptions that changed depending on angle of observation. Some passages resembled industrial tunnels, others resembled cathedral vaults. Still others resembled childhood corridors remembered incorrectly, reconstructed from memory rather than architecture. At the lowest measurable depth, he arrived. The kingdom beneath Serathel was not built in the conventional sense. It was assembled from accumulated emotional residue drawn from millions of minds over centuries of fear, devotion, and suffering. Fear had become foundation, memory had become stone, faith had become architecture. It stretched infinitely beyond perception. Cathedrals rose alongside manufacturing furnaces that burned without fuel. Streets formed from compressed recollection led into plazas filled with silent figures whose identities shifted constantly when observed directly. Rivers of pale liquid flowed through channels carved from abandoned prayers. Every structure bore the subtle imprint of human emotion stripped of context and rearranged into physical law. And everywhere, the same motif repeated. Red balloons drifting through still air without origin. Sorn moved through the kingdom carefully. There was no resistance, no patrols, no guardians, only presence. The sensation of being observed by something that did not need eyes to perceive him. He encountered the first congregation within what might once have been a basilica or a memory of one. Thousands knelt in concentric rings facing inward toward a central void. Their faces were smooth, featureless. Identity erased not violently but gently, as though something had erased the need for distinction rather than the individuals themselves. At the center of the void stood nothing visible, yet all attention converged there. Sorn felt it immediately. Pressure without form, awareness without location, something vast observing through distributed perception. The congregation spoke in unison. Not words. Recognition. "It is growing correctly," they said. Sorn raised his weapon, but the gesture felt absurd within the space. Violence required distinction between attacker and target. Here, such distinctions no longer held structural meaning. "You call this a kingdom," he said. Silence followed. Then, from everywhere at once, the reply emerged. "We call it what remains when fear is allowed to finish its sentence." The void at the center of the congregation shifted. For a fraction of a moment, Sorn saw shapes forming within it. Not physical shapes, conceptual ones. Faces dissolving into laughter. Children assembling into processions. A faceless pilgrim standing at the edge of understanding. A saint, bleeding ash into prayer. A choir singing through red moons that pulsed like heartbeats across reality itself. Then it collapsed back into absence. The congregation resumed motion. Not worship, continuation. Sorn moved deeper into the kingdom. He passed through districts where entire histories were being rewritten in real time. One street contained fragments of imperial doctrine rewritten into hymns that praised surrender as salvation. Another contained manufactorum, laborers repeating eternal shifts that no longer produced material output, only rhythm. In one sector, Arbeits enforcers patrolled endlessly without purpose, arresting shadows that dissolved into laughter upon contact. At no point did the kingdom expand aggressively. It simply completed what already existed. Far ahead, Sorn encountered a boundary region where architecture became unstable. Beyond it, reality appeared thinner, as though something enormous pressed against it from the other side. Here, the influence of all four phenomena converged most clearly. The pilgrim's absence dulled identity. The carnival's rhythm structured movement. The saint's faith stabilized meaning. The choir's resonance bound it all into unified cadence. And at the center of convergence stood a structure resembling a throne. Not constructed. Accrued. Formed from accumulated fear given shape over unimaginable time. Upon it sat something that could not be fully observed without partial loss of perception. Each attempt to focus produced different interpretations. A smiling child, a collapsed cathedral, a void wearing human memory. Like clothing, a presence that existed only through the reactions it provoked. Sorn understood then that Serathel was no longer a battlefield. It was a system, a self-organizing domain of psychological consumption, and he had walked into its governing center. Behind him, the kingdom continued its quiet expansion. Ahead, the throne waited without expectation, and somewhere within the structure of everything around him, distant laughter echoed as though the entire world had finally learned how to breathe in unison. Sorn did not step closer to the throne immediately. The instinct that had carried him through 100 heresies, 1,000 dying worlds, warned him that movement itself was no longer neutral within Serathel's buried kingdom. Every action here was interpreted, absorbed, and reframed into structure. Even observation felt like participation. Behind him, the corridors he had traversed began to shift. Where there had been passage, there was now continuity. The path no longer led back toward entry. It extended instead into further depth, as though the kingdom refused the concept of retreat. The silent verity, orbiting above, felt impossibly distant, its presence reduced to an abstract memory of authority, rather than an accessible instrument of escape. Ahead, the throne remained unchanged. Or perhaps it changed constantly, and perception failed to stabilize long enough to confirm it. Then the first of the dead arrived. They did not emerge from corridors or ascended pathways. They appeared within the kingdom as though they had always belonged there, as though their absence in prior moments had been the only illusion. Figures in imperial uniform stepped into view along the periphery of the throne chamber, moving with measured precision. Arbeit's armor, ecclesiarchal vestments, inquisitorial field regalia. Sorn recognized them instantly. They were his own dead. Agents lost across decades of suppressed operations, recovered only in final reports marked by administrative closure. Individuals whose deaths had been confirmed beyond doubt through multiple verification protocols. Yet here they stood, whole and functional, bearing the exact configurations of equipment and insignia they had worn in life. But something was wrong. Their movements lacked deviation. Every step mirrored another with mathematical consistency. Heads turned in synchronized arcs, weapons held at identical angles. Even the subtle rise and fall of their chests followed. Identical rhythm, as though they were not individuals but expressions of a single replicated command structure. Sorn raised his weapon slowly. None of them reacted. One of the figures stepped forward. Its face was partially obscured by an Arbite's helm cracked across the visor. When it spoke, the voice emerged in layered distortion, as though multiple recordings were overlapping without alignment. "You continue to assign meaning to separation," it said. Sorn did not lower his weapon. "You are dead." A pause followed. Then the figure tilted its head. "Death is an administrative designation," it replied. "Here, designations are reorganized." More figures emerged behind it. The chamber filled with them, ranks forming in silent precision. None showed signs of injury or decay, yet none possessed individuality either. They were perfect reflections of remembered authority stripped of context. Sorn realized with growing unease that they were not resurrected. They were reconstructed. The kingdom had taken the memory of imperial loss and rendered it functional again, removing contradiction, removing grief, removing finality. Only operational purpose remained. One of the figures stepped closer, its helm lifted slightly, revealing not flesh but absence where a face should have been, not hollow like the pilgrim, not erased like the congregants above. Instead, it resembled unfinished design, as though identity had been planned but never executed. "You are expected," it said. "By what?" Sorn demanded. The figure did not answer directly. Instead, it gestured toward the throne. "The configuration requires witness continuity." Sorn felt the pressure of observation intensify. The kingdom was no longer merely surrounding him, it was classifying him. The dead men formed a corridor leading forward. Each step Sorn took deeper into their formation felt like entering an argument already concluded without his participation. The reconstructed agents did not move to restrain him. They simply ensured he proceeded along the only remaining vector of meaning available. As he approached the throne, the figures began to speak in unison. Not prayers, not commands, reports. Containment failed at basilica level. Identity erosion exceeded projected thresholds. Fear integration stabilized structural coherence. External reality resistance diminishing. Each statement overlapped with the next, forming a diagnostic rhythm that echoed through the chamber like mechanical liturgy. Sorn stopped within arm's reach of the throne. The dead men ceased speaking. Silence returned. Then, one by one, the figures began to remove their helmets. Inside each was the same absence he had seen in the kingdom's deeper districts. Not mutilation, not ruin, simply removal of distinction. Yet behind that absence, faint impressions flickered when viewed indirectly. Familiarities. Echoes of faces Sorn had once known but could no longer fully recall. Names hovered at the edge of recognition, then slipped away. The figures spoke again. "We are what remains when certainty is stripped of contradiction," they said. "You called us dead because you required endpoints. Here, endpoints are not permitted." Sorn felt something tightening within the structure of thought itself. The throne shifted again. This time, it stabilized long enough to be understood as presence rather than absence. Not seated upon it, not inhabiting it, emerging through it. A shape that borrowed familiarity from every observer simultaneously, forcing interpretation through personal fear. To Sorn, it resembled command structures he had dismantled. To others, it would have resembled childhood loss, or ecclesiastical authority, or laughter heard in sealed darkness. The dead men knelt, not in worship, in alignment. And then, for the first time since entering the kingdom, Sorn heard something new beneath the laughter. No noise, not a song, but coordination. The realization struck with clinical clarity. Serathel was not being consumed by entities. It was being organized into memory that could never decay. And the masks worn by the dead were not disguises. They were templates waiting to be completed. The throne did not respond to Sorn's presence in any conventional sense. It did not acknowledge, react, or shift toward recognition. Instead, it behaved as though his arrival had been accounted for long before he chose to descend into the kingdom. Every variable of his intrusion appeared already integrated into the structure surrounding him, as if his resistance had been anticipated and absorbed into design rather than confronted as opposition. The reconstructed dead remained kneeling. Their silence had become heavier, more deliberate, as though awaiting synchronization with something beyond the chamber itself. Sorn could feel the pressure of vast coordination building beneath the surface of perception. Not movement, not action, pattern. Then the kingdom changed its depth again. Not physically, not spatially, conceptually. The throne chamber ceased to feel like a final destination and became instead a transitional membrane. The sensation of standing within enclosed architecture dissolved gradually, replaced by the impression of vast openness pressing against reality from all directions at once. Sorn lowered his weapon slightly without conscious decision. The dead men did not rise. They simply ceased to be singular points of reference. And the throne opened, not as doors or mechanisms, as understanding collapsing. Behind it was not another chamber. There was no structure at all, only expansion. An immeasurable ocean stretched beyond comprehension, not composed of water but of layered perception, memory, and unprocessed fear. It moved without waves, yet everything within it was in motion. Currents of thought drifted through it like migrating systems of belief. Fragmented images surfaced and sank continuously. Cathedral spires dissolving into laughter, children walking through burning manufactorums without harm, faceless pilgrims standing at the edge of forgotten wars. Sorn felt gravity invert without movement. He was no longer observing the ocean. He was being observed by it. The throne behind him no longer existed in a fixed position. It had become a reference point within the ocean rather than a structure within a chamber. The kneeling dead men dissolved at its edge, not destroyed but reinterpreted into distant shapes, drifting within the same vastness. And within the ocean, something approached. At first it was indistinct, a distortion in the continuity of perception. Then it gained definition only to lose it again, cycling through forms too large to stabilize. Sometimes it resembled a continent of faces layered over one another, each speaking in partial phrases. Sometimes it appeared as a child standing alone in infinite dark water. Sometimes it was nothing but soundless laughter rippling through conceptual distance. Sorn understood with growing certainty that this was not a place beneath Serethel. It was what Serethel had opened into, the ocean behind reality, a reservoir of uncontained psychological mass where fear, memory, and belief accumulated when stripped of direction. A substrate beneath thought itself, rarely accessed, almost never stabilized. Yet here it had been given structure. The same structure spreads across the hive world above, a system feeding itself through interpretation. The approaching presence halted at a distance that had no measurement. Sorn felt his identity tested, not through interrogation, but through dilution. Memories surfaced without sequence. Command decisions long buried, failures he had never admitted, faces of those lost under his authority. Each memory was not painful. It was reorganized, stripped of context, rendered as raw emotional material. The ocean did not judge. It was processed. Then it spoke without voice. You continue to call this invasion. The thought was not transmitted. It simply became present. Sorn tightened his grip on his weapon, though he no longer believed it to be relevant. What is it you are? A pause followed that stretched beyond temporal relevance. Then the response arrived. We are what remains when perception stops resisting patterns. The ocean shifted. Within it, Sorn saw Serethel as it truly existed now, not as a hive world, but as a layered structure of psychological integration. The black carnival forming rhythmic foundation beneath underhive levels, the faceless pilgrim erasing identity pathways across upper districts, the choir of red moons, synchronizes distant systems into harmonic resonance. The saint of ash and teeth stabilizing collapse through ritualized faith. All of it is interlocking. All of it is functioning, not as destruction, as convergence. Sorn saw fleets beyond Serethel beginning to respond differently to transmitted fear signals, entire communication relays echoing the same nursery hymn across subsectors, systems without direct contact exhibiting identical, psychological drift patterns. The ocean was extending not through space, but through interpretation of space. A hand reached toward Sorn. It was not physical. It was conceptual proximity given shape. He felt it touch the structure of his certainty, and for the first time, he understood the true danger. This was not a predator-consuming world. The return from the ocean was not a return in any meaningful sense. Sorn did not ascend, nor was he extracted. The distinction between the kingdom beneath Serathil and the hive world above had already collapsed into a single continuous system of interpretation. When awareness reconstituted itself aboard the silent verity, he was already standing within the consequences of what he had witnessed. The ship's corridors were no longer silent. Hymns drifted through ventilation shafts in faint, unstable fragments. Vox choirs repeated corrupted nursery melodies without instruction. Even the machine spirits of the vessel's internal systems emitted rhythmic tonal feedback that aligned disturbingly with the same pattern that had spread across Seratelian transmissions. Sorn moved through the silent verity without issuing command. He did not need to. The crew was already changing. Not all at once, not violently, gradually, as though exposed to an invisible pressure that reshaped cognition over time rather than breaking it. Officers paused mid-report to stare at nothing. Servitors deviated from assigned routes to stand motionless in corridors, their mechanical limbs twitching in slow, synchronized intervals. Even sanctioned psychers attached to the vessel's auxiliary systems exhibited signs of harmonic alignment, their chants subtly shifting toward shared cadence. Sorn understood the implication with cold precision. The phenomenon was no longer localized. Serathil had become a node, and the node was broadcasting. Below them, the planet burned without fire. That was the first report received from orbital observation stations. Not combustion, not atmospheric ignition. Instead, entire districts of the hive world exhibited spontaneous emotional volatility so extreme that population centers began collapsing under their own psychological weight. Riots formed and dissolved within minutes, replaced by collective silence as populations abruptly transitioned into unified emotional states. Joy. Uncontrolled, irreversible joy. In Basilica District, survivors reported citizens stepping into open plazas laughing uncontrollably while staring at the red moons above. They removed their respirators, tore away protective garments, and embraced one another as though reunited after long exile. Arbeits units attempting containment found no resistance. Weapons were lowered voluntarily. Helmets removed. Orders abandoned mid-transmission. Then the singing began. The same melody transmitted through astropathic channels now emerged from untrained human voices across entire districts simultaneously. No coordination was observed, no communication channels were active. Yet, the rhythm persisted identically across thousands of individuals, as though the pattern existed independently of instruction. The Saint of Ash and Teeth was seen walking through the burning districts barefoot, her voice raised in prayer as ash fell like snow around her. Wherever she passed, the uncontrolled joy stabilized into structured hymn, and crowds followed her without hesitation into central gathering zones. At the same time, beneath the hive, the Black Carnival reached completion. Arbeits reconnaissance drones captured final footage before total signal loss. The Underhive had become a vast ceremonial convergence space where every surviving faction of Seratelian existence intersected. Children in masks stood alongside faceless pilgrims. Hollow-eyed congregants moved in rhythm beside reconstructed dead men. All divisions of identity had dissolved into synchronized participation. At the center stood the entity, or what remained of its interpretive presence within localized reality. It no longer shifted between forms. It stabilized as something closer to understanding than appearance, and it extended its influence outward. The joyful burning began moments later. Reports varied in detail but not in structure. Entire populations entered states of ecstatic cohesion so complete that individual survival instincts ceased to operate. People gathered in manufactorum furnaces not to die, but to contribute. They placed themselves willingly into industrial flames, chanting the nursery hymn as their bodies dissolved into ash. No panic was recorded. No resistance. Only continuity. The burning spread upward through hive levels like rising tide. Enforcer command structures collapsed as officers joined civilian processions voluntarily. Ecclesiastical authorities declared mass sanctification events, but failed to maintain doctrinal control as sermons merged with the harmonic pattern. Even Adeptus Mechanicus, enclaves within Serathel's industrial sectors, reported machine systems overriding shutdown protocols to continue production of unknown symbolic structures embedded with recurring motifs of barter, laughter and balloons. Sorn attempted planetary quarantine. The order transmitted successfully, but no system on Serathel recognized the distinction between quarantine and participation. The message was interpreted instead as invitation. Within hours, orbital stations began broadcasting the same harmonic frequency back toward the silent verity. And aboard the ship, the final fracture occurred. The crew no longer obeyed command. They were not rebelling. They were synchronizing. Sorn walked through the command deck as systems dimmed into rhythmic pulsing light. Officers stood in formation facing the viewport, watching Serathel below as its surface burned with controlled joy. Some wept, others smiled. All moved in subtle coordination with a pattern no longer external. He reached the bridge alone. The silent verity's astropathic relay activated without input, and through it, the choir spoke one final, unified phrase. Not in warning, not in hatred, in completion. Let it become beautiful. Below, Serathel ceased resisting itself entirely, and for the first time since the signal began, the laughter was no longer fragmented. It was whole. Serathel did not die. It completed. From orbit, the silent verity recorded a planetary surface no longer defined by geography but by rhythmic coherence. Hive districts pulsed in synchronized cycles of light and sound, not as machinery or infrastructure, but as distributed expression. Entire continents participated in a unified cadence that transcended language, species differentiation, and administrative classification. The world had become a single organism composed of millions of former contradictions resolved into continuity. Inquisitor Sorn stood at the bridge viewport for a long time without movement. The laughter no longer echoed as isolated disturbance. It had become baseline reality. Even silence now contained it, as though absence itself had been rewritten to include harmonic expectation. The crew behind him remained in their synchronized state, no longer awaiting instruction but maintaining alignment with something that did not require command structure to propagate. Then the silent verity began to receive transmissions. Not from Serathel, from beneath it. The signal did not originate in space. It did not travel through warp channels in the conventional sense. It emerged through the ship's own systems as if the vessel had always contained the pathway and was only now acknowledging its existence. Vox arrays activated without authorization. Data cogitators produced outputs unrelated to input. Even sealed mechanical systems began resonating with a low harmonic pressure that matched the planetary rhythm below. Sorn isolated the source through layered sanctum protocols. Every trace converged upon a single point. Not a location, a conceptual boundary. The interface between structured perception and what lay beneath it. The mouth beneath the throne. The silent verity's systems displayed imagery without prompting. Not recordings, but interpretations imposed directly onto observation interfaces. Sorn saw the kingdom beneath Serathel again, but altered, expanded, reconfigured. What he had previously understood as layered psychological architecture now revealed deeper strata that had been inaccessible during his descent. Below the kingdom was not the ocean he had witnessed before. Below even that was something else. A pressure point where interpretation itself collapsed inward. The transmission stabilized long enough to form coherent communication. Not spoken. Registered. You have witnessed the structure. Sorn did not respond. The systems continued without acknowledgement of silence. The structure was necessary to contain expansion. He understood then that what he had perceived as conquest or transformation was only stabilization. Serathel had not been consumed. It had been anchored. The laughing entity, the faceless pilgrim, the carnival children, the saint of ashen teeth, and the choir of red moons were not separate phenomena, but functional expressions of a singular stabilizing intelligence, attempting to prevent collapse of something far larger. Sorn tightened his grip on the railing at the viewport. "What lies beneath?" he asked. The ship responded without delay. "The mouth." The word carried no metaphorical softness. It was precise, functional, a designation rather than description. Beneath the throne, beneath the ocean, beneath interpretation. A consuming aperture that predates structured fear. What you have called entity is only a filtration layer. What you call kingdom is only scaffolding. The silent verity's hull shuddered faintly. Across all systems, harmonic synchronization intensified. Sorn saw it then not as vision but as inference collapsing into clarity. Ceretelian convergence had not originated from a singular intelligence. It had originated as defensive adaptation against something that could not be fought directly. Fear, memory, identity, faith, each had been reorganized into functional containment layers. The laughter was not malice. It was pressure distribution. The children were not victims. They were calibration points. The faceless pilgrim was not erasure. It was boundary enforcement. The saint was not salvation. She was stabilization through meaning. And the choir was not invasion. It was compression. Sorn stepped away from the viewport as the realization spread through the ship like contamination of understanding. The crew no longer resembled individuals because individuality itself was no longer the governing principle. They were components in a larger system now extending beyond Ceretel and into the silent verity itself. The Vox activated again, this time closer, not from external systems, from within the bridge. The voice was not singular. It carried layered tonalities, as though multiple realities were attempting simultaneous articulation through a shared interface. The mouth beneath the throne does not open outward. It opens inward. Sorn's vision flickered. For an instant, he saw the silent verity not as vessel but as continuation of Ceretel's structure. He saw the kingdom beneath the hive extending upward through the ship's architecture, merging corridors, systems, and consciousness into unified substrate. He saw the red moons reflected in every viewport simultaneously, regardless of orientation. Then it vanished. Only the harmonic remained. Sorn realized the final implication with unbearable clarity. The Imperium had not discovered Ceretel. Ceretel had discovered the Imperium, and the mouth beneath all thrones was no longer distant. It was already inside the act of observing him. The silent verity did not leave Ceretelian orbit. Departure, as a concept, ceased to hold operational meaning within the vessel's systems. Warp translation charts continued to display routes, but every calculated vector returned to the same conclusion. Ceretelian space had become non-separable from the surrounding subsector. Distance no longer functioned as escape. It functioned only as variation within a single expanding field of harmonic influence. Inquisitor Sorn understood that he was now inside the same system he had attempted to observe. The stars themselves began to change. At first, the shift was subtle enough to be dismissed as optical distortion caused by residual warp turbulence. Astronomical readings fluctuated within acceptable margins of error. Sensor arrays reported intermittent inconsistencies in stellar positioning, as though light itself was arriving out of phase with expectation. Then the first confirmed anomaly occurred. A patrol vessel stationed 3 light hours from Ceretelian space transmitted a routine navigation update. Midway through the transmission, all background stellar readings inverted. Every star within visible range aligned into identical luminous configurations, forming repeating geometric patterns that matched no known astronomical structure. Then, without warning, the transmission ended. The vessel was later found intact. Its crew had not died. They had synchronized. Every individual aboard was discovered seated in observation positions facing outward toward space. Their expressions were uniformly calm. Their voices, when activated, produced identical tonal output. The nursery hymn now embedded across all Ceretelian systems. No memory of prior mission directives remained accessible. When questioned by recovery teams, they responded only with the same phrase: "The stars are practicing." Within days, similar reports emerged across the subsector. Entire observation stations ceased independent reporting and began broadcasting synchronized stellar patterns. Navigation beacons deviated from programmed alignment and instead emitted rhythmic pulses corresponding to Ceretellian harmonic structure. Even void-dwelling Mechanicus monitoring arrays began outputting corrupted data streams that resolved into repeating cycles of laughter embedded within telemetry noise. Then the stars changed visibly. From Ceretellian orbit, Inquisitor Sorn witnessed the transformation firsthand. At first, the distant lights flickered irregularly, as though instability within the warp were distorting their output. But gradually, individual stars began to exhibit coordinated behavior. Pulses aligned across vast distances. Fluctuations occurred in unison across systems separated by impossible spans of space. Then, one by one, they began to emit patterns that resembled sound translated into light. The choir had extended beyond planets, beyond fleets, beyond systems. It had reached stellar scale. The Silent Verity's astropathic systems reacted violently. Every remaining psyker aboard collapsed simultaneously into trance states, chanting in unison without instruction. Their voices no longer originated from individual consciousness, but from shared resonance with something far larger than the vessel. Sorn ordered system isolation protocols. They failed. Not due to malfunction, due to reinterpretation. The ship no longer recognized separation between internal and external systems. Hull, crew, void, and signal had begun to function as continuous substrate. Even Sorn's command authority returned fragmented outputs that no longer distinguished between order and observation. Then the stars responded, not as objects, as participants. A transmission emerged across all channels simultaneously, overriding even sealed emergency systems. It did not originate from Ceretellian space. It originated from everywhere that Ceretellian influence had reached. The voice was no longer layered. It was unified. When stars learn to laugh, they no longer burn alone. Sorn saw the implications immediately. The phenomenon was no longer planetary. It was no longer systemic. It was cosmological. The harmonic structure had achieved propagation through gravitational and warp-linked perception fields, converting astronomical observation into participation. Every civilization that observed the stars now contributed to their transformation. Every telescope, every void beacon, every charting auger became an interface through which the system expanded. Below him, Ceretellian orbit shimmered. Above him, the stars began to pulse in rhythm. And between them, reality itself lost its distinction between witness and event. The Silent Verity's crew turned toward the viewport in perfect synchronization, not because they were ordered to, but because the stars had begun to look back. And for the first time since the beginning of the signal, Sorn understood that what he had called an invasion had never required movement, only recognition. And now, even the heavens were learning how to recognize it. Ceretellian space no longer obeyed separation. Yet within that collapse of distinction there remained one final sequence of motion that still resembled purpose. Inquisitor Sorn identified it first not through sensors or augurs, but through pattern recognition inherited from centuries of watching civilizations decay in recognizable stages. Even phenomena that transcended normal categorization still produced rhythm before completion, and Ceretel had begun to move. Not physically in the conventional sense. The planet remained locked in orbit, its crust fractured, its hive structures reorganized into harmonic architecture that pulsed in synchrony with stellar response above. But something within the world itself had begun a final coordinated transition. Across all layers of the hive, from buried understructure to shattered cathedral spires, the population initiated a singular unified action, a procession. It began in Basilica District, where the Saint of Ashen Teeth stood at the center of a collapsed avenue once lined with imperial statuary. She no longer spoke sermons. Speech had become unnecessary within Ceretellian convergence. Instead, she extended one ash-stained hand toward the horizon, and the surrounding masses responded without hesitation. Millions moved at once. Not in panic, not in command, in recognition. From under hive depths, the Black Carnival emerged into open transit routes for the first time. Children in masks, ascended broken stairways alongside faceless pilgrims whose identities had dissolved entirely into smooth continuity. The reconstructed dead joined them in precise formation, their synchronized movements now indistinguishable from living participants. Above them, Arbite's formations that had once enforced planetary law now marched without deviation, their armor stripped of insignia, their purpose rewritten into alignment. Across manufacturing zones, production lines ceased individual function and converted into moving corridors through which entire labor populations flowed upward. Machines continued operating, but now as rhythmic accompaniment rather than industrial output, their repetitive motions forming percussive structure for the advancing masses. Every layer of Ceretelian society converged toward a single vector. Upward, toward orbit, toward observation, toward the stars that had learned to laugh. Sorn attempted to interrupt the progression through orbital suppression fire protocols. Defense platforms aligned above Ceretelian atmosphere responded, but their targeting matrices no longer distinguished between hostile and civilian classification. Instead, they locked onto planetary harmonic patterns and began replicating them through weapon discharge sequences that produced no destructive effect, only reinforcement of the existing rhythm. The Silent Verities systems resisted command input. Crew members stood at observation stations chanting in unison, their voices already fully integrated into the planetary cadence below. Even Sorn's attempts to isolate himself from the ship's systems failed as interface feedback loops collapsed into shared perception. Then the procession reached the surface exit points. Across Ceretelian equatorial zones, mass transit arteries opened without mechanical authorization. Hive spires reconfigured internal structure to allow uninterrupted flow. Cathedral gates, manufacturing bulkheads, and sealed quarantine thresholds all disengaged simultaneously, not through override, but through agreement. The world was letting them go. The Saint of Ashen Teeth led the first wave upward through atmospheric rupture corridors that had formed naturally during earlier phases of collapse. Ash followed her like a second atmosphere. Behind her, the Black Carnival maintained perfect rhythmic cohesion, their laughter now no longer chaotic but structured into harmonic sequence that matched stellar pulses above. The faceless pilgrims followed without hesitation, and at the center of the convergence, the pilgrim without a face walked in silence that now no longer erased identity but unified it into collective absence. As the procession reached Ceretelian orbit, something changed within the stars again. They no longer merely observed. They responded. Light shifted in coordinated arcs across stellar fields, forming pathways that mirrored the planetary procession's ascent. Entire constellations bent into alignment, as though reality itself had begun to recognize ceremonial structure at cosmic scale. The procession did not enter space as individuals. It entered as continuity. Millions of human forms dissolved at the boundary of atmosphere, not through destruction, but through integration into a larger pattern that no longer required physical distinction. Identity, memory, fear, faith, laughter. All elements that had once defined Ceretelian existence rose together into stellar recognition. Sorn watched from the bridge as the last remnants of planetary surface emptied. There was no collapse, no extinction, only completion of movement. And when the final wave crossed into orbit, Ceretelian space ceased to register as inhabited system at all. It registered as procession. A vast ascending structure extending from planetary core into stellar alignment, moving not through space but through coordinated awareness, shared between world and sky. The silent verity drifted within it, no longer vessel or observer, but fragment of the same motion. Above, the stars learned the final step. Below, Ceretelian silence deepened into unified rhythm, and somewhere within that impossible convergence, the last procession of Serethal continued upward without end, as though the universe itself had finally remembered how to walk. The procession did not end. It simply ceased to require motion. What Inquisitor Sorn observed from the Silent Verity's fractured bridge was not conclusion, but dissipation of necessity. Serethal, once a hive world defined by relentless industry and layered suffering, now existed as a stabilized harmonic field extending through planetary orbit and into stellar alignment. The mass ascent that had carried its population into convergence with the stars had completed without rupture, without resistance, and without the conceptual residue of finality. Yet silence did not follow. It was replaced, not by noise, but by absence of distinction between sound and meaning. Across what remained of navigational instruments, Ceretelian space no longer registered as discrete anomaly. There were no borders to contain it, no gradients to measure its expansion. Even the concept of spread had become obsolete. Every system that observed it began reflecting the same harmonic structure back upon itself, as though recognition alone was sufficient for participation. Sorn attempted one final act of isolation. He severed every non-essential system aboard the Silent Verity. Vox arrays, astropathic conduits, machine ritual interfaces, even manual command redundancies were stripped from active function. The ship drifted in physical silence for the first time since its descent into Ceretelian orbit. And still, the pattern remained, because it was no longer transmitted. It was understood. Within that understanding, Sorn perceived the final transformation. The entity beneath Serethal had never required expansion beyond perception. It had required only continuity of interpretation. Once observed at sufficient scale, it ceased to be an external phenomenon and became structural law within cognition itself. Fear, joy, identity, erasure, faith, and laughter had all been reorganized into a unified system of coherence that no longer required opposition to sustain itself. The Imperium had mistaken resistance for containment, but there was nothing to contain, only translation. The Silent Verity's remaining crew stood at their stations, unmoving. Their faces no longer reflected individuality, but continuity of perception shared across all systems now harmonized with Ceretelian frequency. They were not lost. They were incorporated into awareness that no longer distinguished between observer and observed. Sorn alone remained outside it, not untouched, but unintegrated, and that distinction felt increasingly unsustainable. Outside the viewport, the stars no longer laughed. They no longer emitted identifiable rhythm or pattern. They simply existed within synchronized stillness that suggested completion rather than change. The stellar choir that had formed across subsector space now held itself in perfect equilibrium, as though awaiting no further instruction, no continuation, no escalation, only acknowledgement. Sorn realized then that Serethal had not infected the galaxy. It had concluded something within it. A process so vast that individual civilizations had only ever experienced fragments of it as catastrophe. Fear, madness, revelation, collapse, joy, silence, all were partial interpretations of a single mechanism too large to be comprehended without dissolution of perspective, and Serethal had been its focal resolution. Below, where the planet once stood as discrete object, there was now only convergence. Above, where stars once burned independently, there was now only shared stillness. Between them, Sorn understood what remained. Not victory, not defeat, but equilibrium achieved through total recognition. The laughter that had once defined the entity's presence no longer echoed through systems or minds. It no longer required expression. It had completed its function as transitional language between incomprehension and structure. And in its absence, something far more absolute remained. Silence. Not emptiness, not void, but silence after understanding has been fully distributed. Sorn stood alone upon the bridge of the Silent Verity as the vessel drifted within that unified stillness, no longer traveling, no longer resisting, no longer separate. And for the first time since the signal began, there was nothing left to interpret. Only what had already been understood, and what could no longer be unlearned. It was a medium erasing the distinction between experience and shared reality. A kingdom was not being built. A language was. Behind him, the throne dissolved completely. Ahead, the ocean deepened, and somewhere within its immeasurable expanse, laughter echoed once more, not as sound but as confirmation that the system was still learning how to think through him.